Hello all, welcome to today's class. So my name is Dayal Paleri. I'm a PhD scholar at the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at IIT Madras. So for the next two classes, we'll be talking about the decolonial school in sociology. We'll be dealing with decolonialism, how sociology as a discipline was impacted or shaped by the recent rise of decolonial debates in general in social sciences. So we will be dealing with that in the next two classes. So as you have been listening to various sociological traditions broadly within Indian sociology, but also I think that you'll be familiar with the sociological traditions in the global scale as such. So you must be familiar that sociology as a discipline has its origin in Europe, right? In Western Europe, to be particular. The three classical sociological thinkers in the sociological canon are Marx, Durkheim, and Weber, all of them who come from France or Germany, such Western European countries. And if you think about that, the idea of society that early sociologists or the sociological canon theorized is largely the society in Western Europe, right? But we know that when we study sociology today, we more or less refer to these three European thinkers as the classical sociological thinkers. So if you think about their body of work, it is very clear that the idea of society they were dealing with or they were writing about was largely European society, right? So this is where the decolonial sociology becomes very important, because this problematizes the fundamental question that whose society was the subject of study of classical or even modern sociology to great extent, right? So the decolonial school in that way becomes a mode of rethinking of sociological canon itself. So in today's class we'll also here is the context of so I'm talking about the context of decolonial sociology. It also comes from increasing awareness how sociology as a discipline is inextricably connected with the process of colonialism. And it also looks at the politics of knowledge production, right? The knowledge production, often knowledge or sociological or any other social science knowledge is taken more or less as regarded as non-political, right? But here in the decolonial thinking, the process of knowledge production itself is seen as a product of certain power dynamics. So this is the broader context of the decolonial intervention in sociology that we'll be talking in the next in this class and the next class. So the class will be broadly based on this particular article that appeared in the journal Current Sociology, which is being published by International Sociological Association. And the article's title is Sociology's Encounter with the Decolonial, the problematic of indigenous versus that of coloniality, extraversion, and colonial modernity. So as you can see, this article was recently published, and which also tells us that the decolonial tradition is a very recent tradition within the sociological school. And the author is Professor Sujata Patel, who was formerly a professor of sociology at the University of Hyderabad and currently a fellow in the Indian Institute of Advanced Studies and Savitribai Phule University. So she is a very high regarded sociologist who is globally renowned in her contribution on various aspects of sociology. But recently she has been part of a network of sociologists from the global south who is put forwarding or who is formulating the idea of decolonial sociology as a very coherent sociological school that critique not only the classical sociological canon but also the modern sociological canon. If you are familiar with the works that ranges from Ulrich Beck and the recent sociologists who have been highly regarded, so they also problematize the modern sociological canon. So before we delve into the article, little bit of background here. So I hope all of you are familiar with what do we mean by the process idea of decolonization, right? To understand decolonial sociology, we should have a prior understanding of what constitute decolonialization. So decolonization is the process through which the colonial imperialist states withdrew from colonized countries and what was initiated soon after the end of the Second World War. It's a very familiar process. This our country, this particular process is particularly important for understanding Indian sociology, because Indian sociology was largely institutionalized, or even the idea of Indian sociology was largely institutionalized only after the process of the British withdrawal of power from Indian subcontinent, right? So decolonization is the process through which colonial and imperialist states withdrew from the colonized countries. So we know there are a lot of socio-political reasons behind it. It is not a very voluntaristic thing, but also largely due to the kind of social changes going on in the world, especially with the Second World War, as well as the rise of anti-colonial movements within each colonies, like the International Congress in India, right? So these socio-political forces has given rise to this particular process, and this process is very important in understanding how sociology as a discipline is formed in not only in the colonies, also in the colonizers context. So we know that the decolonization, in the process of decolonization, it is the Europeans largely who was the colonizer, and the non-Western countries such as Africans, Asian or Latin American countries who was the colonized. So these particular geopolitical relations, power relations, continued even after the process of colonization, that you must be familiar in various other ways, such as the process of neo-colonization and so on. So these particular power relations between the colonizer and the colonized is particularly important in understanding the decolonial critique. We will come to this point in more detail a bit later. The process of decolonization, we know that it led to the formation of new nation states. Take India for example. Even though there are contentions that idea of India has existed even prior to the arrival of British, but India as a nation state as we know it today has formed only in the late 1940s, 1950s. With the adoption of Indian constitution, we formally became a nation state, which is more or less the story in every other decolonized countries, right? So there are two important processes that is particularly important when we talk about nation building or the formation of the new nation state. As this nation state has been established as a young newly nation, they need to have two important pillars for the nation building. The first is much talked about, the idea of national development, the idea to have a sovereign economy, right? You are sovereign now in political terms, but you should also be sovereign in a more economic sense, right? So that is where we talk about the industrialization and development of the nation state. But a particularly important and associated process is the emergence of nationalist social sciences and the need to have sovereign theories about national reconstruction, right? While much has been written on the national development and how development as a process important for the newly independent nations, we seldom talk about how the emergence of social science institutions are equally important in the imagination of the newly independent nation state, right? Because we not only need sovereign national economics, but we also need sovereign theories about to legitimize the independent existence of the nation state. So that is why soon after we are independent, the Indian government has established a series of social science institutions, also formed the Indian Council for Social Science Research and so on. And this also parallel to other forms of knowledge, so not just in social sciences. If you know, the Indian Institute of Technology is established across India, it's also part of this idea of sovereign nation, sovereign technology and so on. So these two processes are particularly important to give a context of the emergence of sociology in India itself. Yeah, so what are the kind of imperatives of the newly formed nation state and the emergence of the sovereign nationalistic social sciences, right? So as we already talked, the decolonization and the emergence of new nation state has immediately led to the emergence of national social science institutions. And it also corresponded with a need to produce not just national institutions, but also a nationalistic social sciences, and in our case a nationalistic sociology that would in turn legitimize the existence and the boundaries and the legitimacy of the newly formed nation state, in our case India. therefore the emergence of Indian sociology, right? So therefore the emergence of Indian sociology is very much connected with the question of national sovereignty itself. So this is the background of the emergence of nation state. So therefore it is very clear that the process of decolonization has also given rise to newer forms of nationalistic sociology across the world. In that way, how did it change sociology is an important question that I will be dealing with. And then later, in all this newly independent nation state, later very recently a decolonized perspective of sociology has emerged, which also we will deal in detail in the coming slides. How did that affect sociological tradition that has been largely centered on European experiences, right? So as we all know who are familiar with the traditional sociological canon, the main role of the metropole or the center or Europe is to collate and process data and produce theory, right? Most of the theoretical concepts that we know in sociology today, be it class, status, and our idea of gender, sexuality, and all those things has been first theorized in the European context, and then it has been exported and being used by the sociologist in the periphery, in the global south, right? This is the traditional power exchanges, or this is the circuit of knowledge production in sociology, in traditional sociology. And let's see how decolonization perspective challenges the idea. So let's come back to Sujata Patel's article. So she actually identifies there are two schools of decolonial sociology emerged in the global south. In her opinion, decolonial perspective is not actually very new, even though the kind of decolonial perspective that she subscribes to, which will come later, is kind of new. There has been another form of decolonial perspective in sociology that has rised just after the formation or the process of decolonization itself, which she refers to as the indigenous sociology. The first kind of decolonial sociology that emerged in the global south, according to Sujata Patel, is the indigenous sociology. So what is indigenous sociology? So indigenous sociology questions the conceptual validity, political legitimacy, and ethical grounding of the post-enlightenment Western civilization and its knowledge, and assert instead the difference, it's a key word here, the difference in understanding of the national social. It grounds this difference from Europe West in a notion of belonging, a cultural identity defined within a locality, geography, and a territory. So the idea is that this kind of indigenous sociology actually problematizes the idea of what constitutes the national social, right? Whose society are you studying? Whose experience, based on whose experience are you building the sociological concept? So they actually challenged that much of the sociological ideas, theories, canons that he is being presented as the universal sociological theories actually is a very provincialized one, which is largely derived on the experiences of the post-enlightenment Western civilization, right, in the 18th, 19th, and early 20th century. And they asserted an idea of a fundamental difference of experiences of empirical realities between the West and non-West. And then they put forward a notion that one need to produce their own sociological theories based on ideas or concept that derive from the particular cultural identities, cultural atmosphere defined within a locality, geography, and territory. So if you have to produce an indigenous sociology of Indian society, you need to look at not the theories or experiences from the Western sociology, but you need to look at how the society is organized, what are the indigenous concepts or theories being used by the people of India to understand themselves in their own context. So you need to look at that and derive sociological theories and concepts from one's own cultural atmosphere or cultural belongingness and cultural identities. So this is the fundamental claim or fundamental thesis of indigenous sociology. But then Patel identified a more sophisticated, a more revisionist, a more refined form of decolonial school, emerged from the global south very recently, which she more or less calls as a neo-Marxist decolonial sociology. So it doesn't mean that they identify themselves as a neo-Marxist, which it only means that the kind of the later decolonial schools has more or less inspired from some traditions within the broad neo-Marxist tradition. So there are, and this is also not a coherent school. This is a term that Sujata Patel coins for to have for an analytical purpose of different schools in decolonial sociology. And she says in the recent times, let's say after the last 20-30 years, different scholars have used, and very independently of each other without mutual exchanges, they use Marxist ideas on social structuring of knowledge to make a methodological and epistemic critique of European and Western sociology or social sciences together with the nationalist indigenous knowledge system. So what they did, they used the Marxist ideas on how knowledge is actually produced, how the production of knowledge is very much connected with the social structure or the unequal relation between the global north and the global south, the center and the periphery, and they actually advanced not just an epistemic critique, not just a critique of the Western concept or Western theory of knowledge, but also the methodology of how the Western social science or sociology has been constructed. And they also advanced a critique of the first form of decolonial sociology, which is a nationalistic indigenous knowledge system. So 2 points are very important, that they not only offered a critique of the sociological epistem or the sociological knowledge, but also the methodology of the Western European sociology, as well as they critiqued the indigenous sociology that was emerged soon after the process of decolonization. We will go into the details of these 2 kinds of decolonial schools in the next few minutes. So before going into the details of each 2 schools, Patel outlines 5 methodological aspects of decolonial approach in sociology. So the first point to keep in mind is that there are geographically varied and intellectually diverse decolonial critique being formulated using sociological theory to critique the universals propounded by traditions of Western sociology and social sciences. So even when we use categories like global north and global south, west and non-west, we should understand that we shouldn't treat either global south or non-west as very homogeneous category, right? For example, in our context, we often use sociological tradition that come from Latin America, Africa, Asia, and we know how much heterogeneous each of these 3 regions are. Therefore, naturally, the decolonial critique that emerges from all these regions is also intellectually diverse. So even when we use the term decolonial sociology, it doesn't mean that there are much internal agreements. It is as diverse and geographically varied as possible. So this is the first point to keep in mind. And the second point is this multiple current engaged with the heritage of academic colonialism in each specific nation, state, region, territory in distinct time period and relation to specific colonial state. So we know, even when we use, let's say, the term like colonizer, there has been different colonizers, right? Most of the Western European countries colonized different regions, and countries like Japan colonized. So the experiences of each colonies has been very different depending on who was the colonizer, right? So these difference in experiences also constitute a factor in what kind of decolonial critique that emerged from each of these different regions. So that is also another important point to keep in mind when we think about decolonial critique in sociology. So thirdly, that some of these recent critique also interrogate their own distinct native scholarship and question both colonial Western and native indigenous scholars who propagates this. So we need to understand the object of the decolonial critique was not only the West, it was also a self-interrogating critique, and that makes it much more valuable. Right? We know that sociological concept has to be methodologically self-critical, right? One to evaluate any scientific theory or scientific approach, it should be able to correct itself as we apply to different contexts. Similarly, the decolonial critique that emerged from various contexts was not only critical of the non-Western theory or the sociological canon, but it was also critical of the kind of indigenous or nationalist social sciences that emerged from one's own context. And thirdly and fourthly, it's a very important assumption about decolonial critique that the understanding that sociology or social sciences in general, even though claims to be universal, it is actually constituted within the politics of differences organized within colonial, nationalistic, and global geopolitics. So the idea is that there are understanding of differences, different kind of understanding about differences that constitute the fundamentals of ideas about our society. For example, the difference between the West and the non-West, the spiritual and the material, the state and society, individual and society, structure and agency, and so on. So this idea of difference, the difference which has been produced in the process of colonialism, is fundamental, produced through the process of colonization and persisting to the contemporary geopolitics, is fundamental to the constitution of the discipline of sociology or social sciences itself. So this amounts to an understanding or awareness about how power continues to play an important role in the constitution of social science discipline. So this amounts to the politics of knowledge production that we alluded to earlier. So this is the fourth important assumption or the premise of our decolonial critique. And finally, is that this difference, the idea of difference that constitute the sociology or contemporary social sciences, is reproduced in everyday knowledge practices and being structured through the political economy of knowledge. So it is the idea of difference that informs every modern social science discipline is actually reproduced through everyday institutional knowledge practices, as well as the larger the political economy of the knowledge flow across the globe. So these 2 points will come in detail in the coming slides. These are some of the methodological aspects or assumptions of the decolonial approach to sociology that Patel outlines. Okay, now we will come to the first current in decolonial sociology that Patel identifies, which is the indigenous sociology, which informed by an assumption of methodological nationalism. So we will come to that point in detail. So there are 4 concerns of India. So this is is a school of decolonial thought that emerged in the newly independent nations in the immediate aftermath of decolonization, right, in the 1950s or 1960s, depending upon the context. So there are 4 concerns for the nationalistic or the indigenous sociology in this newly independent nations, according to Patel. The first is the constitution of social sciences concepts in local regional languages with the use of local resources, right. So I told you before, this correspondent to the need of having a sovereign social theories, sovereign theories about nation building or even national identity. So there's a compulsion to produce social science concepts in local regional languages with the use of local resources, right. You need to build your theories from your own cultural, socio-economical surroundings and not look at the Western experiences or the Western theories. And the second is the promotional research by insider citizens rather than outsiders and non-citizens. So let's take the case of India. So during the colonial time, most of the sociologists or even anthropologists of the time, or even any kind of social scientist of the time, was the British themselves or people who associated with the colonizers, right. All these social science disciplines emerged as part or very much connected to the process or the project of colonialism itself. So now with the emergence of nationalistic social sciences or sociology, there is a promotion to have native social scientists, so Indians themselves. So they might be educated in the non-West, but they need to be attentive, or they need to be Indians, and they need to have a commitment towards the emerging nation and its nation building itself. So the idea of having social scientists who are insider to the society becomes particularly important. Thirdly, the determination of research priorities in terms of national priorities, and that in turn can aid the nation state in evaluating its development programs or national reconstruction. So it is also, it's very clear that the newly independent nationalist sociology was not very autonomous in terms of its thinking, but it was prioritized based on national priorities. Let's think about the 1950s and 60s, the kind of priorities that Indian nation building project has on development is largely in terms of building our economy. So all the social sciences should be able to assist that larger project. So this was another important assumption. And then fourthly is formulating autonomous and alternative theoretical and methodological paradigms in terms of local, national, philosophical and cultural legacies. So this is also, one could also say that this also led to the idea of having building a sociology based on our civilization legacies. So here this is actually connected to all the 3 points that we discussed, that the theoretical and methodological paradigms that this national sociology build should actually take its resources, or should actually build in reference to our own cultural paradigms. So we will see how that actually played out by a few of the nationalist sociologists in Indian as well as in other contexts. We end this class here. So in the next class, we will go in detail to the two kinds of decolonial sociology, specifically the indigenous sociology as well as the neo-Marxist traditions in detail, and we also present a uh, broad discussions on what direction the decolonial sociology can take. Thank you.